The chamber smelled like ozone and old power, and Ambassador Idris Okonkwo had learned to breathe it in without flinching. He stood at the lowest tier of the Galactic Conquered Hall, a vast ring-shaped arena carved into the belly of Tyvelis Prime, the neutral station that floated between three dead stars like a pearl caught in the teeth of the void. And from where he stood, he could see every single species that considered itself superior to his own. 312 delegations sat above him in rising rows of polished stone and living crystal, their seats arranged not by alphabet or region but by age. And age in the Conquered meant everything, because the oldest species sat at the top where the air was clean and the light was golden, and the youngest sat at the bottom near the drainage vents where the recycled atmosphere carried the faint tang of something chemical and unpleasant. Earth's delegation occupied the very last row. Okonkwo did not sit, because there were only 2 chairs assigned to humanity's section, and Captain Una Vasquez occupied one of them while the other held their equipment case. So he stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his spine straight, and his dark eyes scanning the room with the patience of a man who had trained himself never to blink first. Vasquez sat with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and she wore her naval uniform like armor, every crease sharp enough to cut, and her fingers kept drifting toward the comm unit on her wrist, as if she wanted to call the UEN longbow parked in orbit above them and ask Commander Reese Tanaka to aim something heavy at the station. But she did not, because Okonkwo had asked her not to make any aggressive gestures, and she respected him enough to listen. The session had been going on for 3 hours already, and Earth had not yet been called to speak. First came the Thanari trade proposals, delivered by Speaker Zorath Valkesson himself, a towering insectoid figure whose bioluminescent plates shifted from violet to deep blue as he spoke, and his voice carried through the chamber like the hum of a cathedral organ, rich and ancient, and full of the certainty that comes from belonging to a species that had been crossing stars when humanity was still arguing about whether the Earth was flat. Then came the Dravosi resource allocations, presented by Trade Minister Gela Soon, a 6-limbed amphibian whose wet black eyes reflected the chamber lights like twin pools of oil. And she spoke about fuel distribution and mining rights, and supply chain quotas, with the casual authority of someone who knew that 14 species, including humanity, depended entirely on her people for faster-than-light fuel. Then came 7 more species with 7 more proposals, and 7 more reminders that the galaxy had been running just fine for millennia before humans showed up. Finally, 4 hours into the session, Speaker Valkesson turned his long, angular head toward the lowest tier and said in a tone that carried the warmth of a winter morgue, "The Conquered recognizes the provisional delegation from Earth." Okonkwo stepped forward and activated his translation disc and looked up at 312 species looking down at him, and he began to speak. "Honored delegates," he said, and his voice was calm and clear and carried no anger. "Earth has been a provisional member of this Conquered for 40 standard years, and in that time humanity has contributed freely to the welfare of this body without reservation and without condition." He listed what Earth had given: medical breakthroughs shared openly with any species that asked, disaster relief fleets deployed to 9 separate worlds during crises that had nothing to do with human interests, terraforming innovations that had saved 2 dying colonies from extinction, and agricultural techniques adapted for alien biologies that fed populations humanity would never meet. "We have proven our value," Okonkwo said, "and we have proven our character, and today Earth formally petitions for full membership and voting rights within the Galactic Conquered." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the laughter began. It started with the Korvathi delegation, a cluster of heavy-scaled reptilians who sat in the mid-tiers and who had never liked humanity for reasons they never bothered to hide, and the lead Korvathi delegate, a broad-shouldered creature named Drethvaro, let out a barking sound that his species used to express deep amusement, and then leaned into his microphone and said, Full membership for the endurance-bred prey animals who learn to stack rocks. How delightful. The laughter spread. Not every delegation joined in, but enough of them did, and the ones who did not laugh simply looked away as if the whole display was beneath their attention, which was somehow worse, because at least the ones who laughed acknowledged that Earth existed. Vasquez's hands went white-knuckled on the armrests of her chair, and Okonkwo could feel her fury radiating like heat from a reactor core. But he did not turn around, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not allow a single muscle in his face to move. Speaker Valkesson waited for the noise to subside, and then folded his 4 slender arms and looked down at Okonkwo with an expression that might have been pity if it had contained any warmth at all. "The Conquered thanks Earth for its enthusiasm," Valkesson said, "and acknowledges the contributions listed. However, the petition for full membership requires a maturity threshold that the human species has not yet demonstrated, and the matter will be tabled for future review at an unspecified date." Unspecified. That word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything worth saving. Okonkwo nodded once, turned on his heel and walked back to his seat, and Vasquez stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor, and the sound cut through the chamber like a blade. And together they gathered their equipment and left through the lowest exit, the one that led to the service corridors where the maintenance drones worked and the air recyclers hummed, and no one of importance ever walked. They did not speak as they boarded the shuttle. They did not speak as the shuttle climbed away from Tiveli's prime and arced toward the longbow waiting in high orbit like a dark knife against the stars. They did not speak as they passed through the airlock and into the narrow steel corridors of the only human warship in the system. It was only when they reached the private briefing room and the door sealed behind them that Vasquez finally spoke. "They laughed at us, Idris." "Yes," he said. "They will keep laughing." "Yes," he said again. "So what do we do now?" Okonkwo looked at her for a long moment and something shifted behind his eyes, something old and tired and finished with hopping, and he said, "We go home and we tell them the truth." 12 hours later and 47 light-years away, General Secretary Lion Chung sat in a sealed room beneath the old city of Geneva and watched the recording of the session play out on a screen that filled the entire wall. And she watched her ambassador be mocked, and she watched her species be dismissed, and she watched the Korvathi call her people prey animals, and her face showed nothing at all. When the recording ended, she sat in silence for exactly 1 minute. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a file that had no digital copy, a file that existed only on paper because paper could not be hacked, and the cover was stamped with 2 words in red ink. Covenant 0. She opened it and read the first page even though she had already memorized every word, and then she closed it and looked at the blank screen where the laughter had been, and she whispered to the empty room with the voice of a woman who had just finished being patient. They had their chance. General Secretary Lion Chung had not become the most powerful human alive by being loud, and she had not survived 30 years in intelligence work by being obvious, and she had not held Earth's highest office for 2 terms by making decisions out of anger. But she was angry now. She sat at the head of a long black table in the joint security bunker beneath Lake Geneva, 60 meters below the waterline, in a room that officially did not exist, and around her sat the 7 people who knew the truth about what Earth had been building in secret for 3 decades. Ambassador Okonkwo sat to her left, still wearing the same suit he had worn at the Conquered, and his face carried the careful blankness of a man who had swallowed a humiliation so large it would take years to digest. Captain Vasquez sat beside him, and she had not changed out of her naval uniform either, and her eyes moved around the room with the restless energy of a predator trapped in a cage that was about to be opened. Across from them sat Dr. Emeka Ademi, a tall, quiet man with gray at his temples, and the hands of someone who had spent 20 years taking apart machines that alien engineers swore could never be understood by human minds. And next to him sat Commander Reese Tanaka, who looked like he had not slept in a week because he had not. Because he had spent the last 7 days running readiness drills with a fleet that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. Jung activated the wall display, and the room went dark except for the soft blue glow of classified files scrolling across the screen, and she began to speak in the same flat, calm voice she used when she was at her most dangerous. "Before we discuss what comes next," she said, "I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what the Conquered has done to us, not what they said at the session, but what they have been doing since the day we joined." She pulled up the first file and it showed a web of treaties, 4,217 of them, each one signed by Earth over the past 40 years, and each one presented to humanity as a gift, as an opportunity, as a welcome into the galactic family. "These are our chains," Jung said. She highlighted the Dravosi Fuel Compact, which guaranteed Earth access to FTL fuel at so-called fair market rates that were triple what the elder species paid. And the compact also prohibited Earth from developing alternative fuel sources, buried in subsection 49 of a document that was 800 pages long and written in a legal language that humanity had only partially learned to read at the time of signing. She highlighted the Korvathi Navigation Accord, which gave Earth access to 12 star systems for colonization, 12 out of the millions available, and which imposed population caps on every human colony that ensured humanity could never grow large enough to rival even a mid-tier species. She highlighted the Thenari Technology Framework, which allowed Earth to purchase alien technology but banned reverse engineering, banned independent development of competing systems, and required Earth to submit all new inventions for Conquered review before deployment. "Every treaty we signed was designed to do one thing," Jung said. "Keep us small, keep us dependent, and keep us grateful for the privilege of being kept." Okonkwo leaned forward and said, "To be fair, Madam Secretary, we did benefit from many of these agreements. We gained access to FTL travel, to medical knowledge, to material science that advanced our civilization by centuries." "We did," Chung agreed, "and a cage with a window is still a cave." She turned to Dr. Adami and nodded, and the scientist stood and walked to the display with the careful movements of a man who was about to reveal something that would change the shape of the conversation, and possibly the shape of history. 22 years ago, Adami began, a small team at the Lagos Advanced Research Institute began a project called Solfire, and our mission was simple. We wanted to know if the Dravosi were telling the truth when they said their fuel monopoly was based on physics that humans could not replicate. He paused, and a thin smile crossed his face, the first real emotion anyone had seen from him all day. They were lying. He pulled up schematics on the display, and the room filled with diagrams of something beautiful and terrifying, a reactor design unlike anything the Conquered had ever shared. And he explained in simple terms that cascade fusion was not impossible for humans. It was not even particularly difficult once you understood the underlying principles. And the reason the Dravosi had kept it secret was not because the science was beyond humanity, but because the science was so elegant that any species smart enough to look for it would find it. "We have been energy independent for 11 years, Adami said. "Every human colony has backup cascade reactors hidden in their infrastructure, and the Dravosi fuel we have been importing during that time has been going straight into reserve storage." Vasquez let out a low whistle, and even Okonkwo looked surprised, and Jung watched their reactions with the satisfaction of someone who had been carrying a very heavy secret for a very long time. Then she turned to Commander Tanaka. Tanaka stood, and he did not smile because smiling was not something he did, and he pulled up a tactical display that showed the solar system, but not the solar system that the Conquered saw when they scanned human space. A different one, the real one. "The shadow envelope," he said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that made people lean in to listen. 214 warships built over 18 years in deep solar orbits beyond Neptune, constructed from materials mined by automated systems in the Kuiper Belt, assembled in facilities that are invisible to every scanning technology the Conquered currently uses. The display filled with ship silhouettes, destroyers and frigates and electronic warfare vessels, and a command carrier called the Thermopylae that was larger than anything Earth had ever publicly built. And every single one of them ran on cascade fusion and carried weapons systems that Dr. Adami's team had developed in secret. "The Conquered thinks we have 30 ships," Tanaka said. "They are wrong by a factor of 7. The room was silent for a long time after that. Okonkwo was the first to speak, and his voice was careful. "Madam Secretary, I have spent my career believing that diplomacy was the path forward for our species, and I still believe that. But I also recognize that what you are showing me today changes the calculation entirely." "It does," Chung said. "What exactly are you proposing?" Chung stood and walked to the display, and she looked at the web of treaties that had kept humanity in its place for 40 years, and she said, 3 weeks ago the Conquered passed the Terran Limitation Amendments without consulting us, new restrictions that cap our off-world population growth and impose tariffs on our medical exports. And they did this because they know we cannot fight back." She turned to face the room. "Except we can." She laid out the final piece, the Prometheus Array, a communications and cyber warfare network that Dr. Adami's team had woven into the Conquered's own data relay infrastructure over the past decade, hidden inside routine software updates that Earth had been contracted to provide, because human programmers were cheap and reliable, and no one thought to check their work too carefully. The Prometheus Array could crack every encryption protocol in the Conquered, could broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, could blind an enemy fleet's communications in seconds, and could pull every dirty secret from every classified server in the galactic network. "We signed those treaties as a young species begging for scraps," Chung said, and her voice filled the room like water filling a tank, steady and rising and impossible to stop. "We are no longer young, and we no longer beg." She looked at each person at the table one by one, Okonkwo with his wounded dignity, Vasquez with her caged fury, Adami with his quiet pride, and Tanaka with his cold readiness. "Withdraw from everything," she said. Okonkwo closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed in the way he held himself, as if a weight he had been carrying since Tyveli's prime had not been lifted, but had been replaced by something heavier and sharper, and far more useful. "When?" he asked. 14 days, Jing said. "I want them to think we are licking our wounds. I want them to pass more amendments. I want them to laugh one more time, and then I want the laughter to stop." Nobody in the room disagreed. 14 days, that was all the galaxy had left of the old order. 14 days before humanity stopped asking for permission and started making demands. And the Conquered did not know it yet, but the species they had mocked as prey animals had spent 30 years sharpening claws that nobody had ever thought to look for. The 14th day arrived on a Tuesday by Earth reckoning, which meant nothing to the galaxy but meant everything to the people who had been counting the hours. And when the clock struck midnight in Geneva, the machine that Lian Chung had spent her entire career building began to move. It moved in silence. Across 12 star systems and 47 embassies and 9 trade stations, human personnel received a single coded message on devices that the Conquered did not know existed, and the message contained one word: a road. On Tyveli's prime, Ambassador Idris Okonkwo woke in his quarters at the human embassy, a small, ugly building on the station's lower levels that smelled of recycled air and institutional carpet, and he dressed in his finest suit, the dark blue one with the silver thread that his daughter had given him before he left Earth. and he looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who was about to do something that could not be undone. He walked to the Conquered Hall alone. The session was routine, a mid-cycle review of trade quotas that most delegates attended out of obligation rather than interest, and the chamber was perhaps two-thirds full when Okonkwo entered through the lowest door and took his position at the bottom tier, and Speaker Val Kesson glanced down at him with the lazy disinterest of someone noticing an insect on a windowsill. Okonkwo waded through 2 hours of Dravosi trade reports and Thenari infrastructure proposals, and a particularly boring dispute between two species about mining rights on a moon that neither of them actually wanted. And then, when the agenda reached open comments, he activated his translation disk and requested the floor. Val Kesson almost did not grant it, but protocol required him to acknowledge any standing delegate, and so he waved one of his 4 arms and said, "Earth is recognized." Okonkwo stepped forward, and the chamber fell into the kind of half-silence that audiences give to speakers they do not take seriously, a silence with whispers at its edges. "Honored delegates," Okonkwo said, and his voice was different today, not louder but harder, as if each word had been cut from stone. 40 years ago, humanity came to this chamber and signed its first treaty with the Galactic Conquered, and in the decades since we have signed 4,217 more, each one presented to us as a partnership, each one accepted by us in good faith. He paused and looked up at the rising tiers of alien faces. That faith has been answered with contempt. The whispers died. Earth has given freely, Okonkwo continued. We shared medical breakthroughs that saved millions of lives across dozens of worlds. We sent disaster relief fleets to planets we had never visited. We developed terraforming technology and gave it away without charge. And in return, we were seated at the bottom of this chamber next to the drainage vents and told to be grateful for the privilege. His voice did not rise, but it did not need to, because every word landed in the silence like a hammer on an anvil. 2 weeks ago, this body passed the Terran Limitation Amendments, restricting our population growth and taxing our medical exports. And you did this without consulting us, without informing us, and without caring whether we agreed, because you do not see us as partners, you see us as a resource to be managed. He reached into his jacket and produced a small data chip, and held it up so the chamber's cameras could capture it. This chip contains Earth's formal notice of withdrawal from every treaty, accord, compact, and agreement we have ever signed with this body. All 4,217 of them, effective immediately. The silence that followed was not the mocking silence of 2 weeks ago. It was the silence of 300 species trying to understand what they had just heard. Earth recognizes no further obligation to any signatory of the Galactic Conquered, Okonkwo said. We withdraw our medical exports, our disaster relief commitments, our terraforming contracts, and our colonial boundary agreements. And we do this not in anger but in clarity, because we have learned that dignity cannot be petitioned for, it can only be claimed. He placed the chip on the podium and turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the chamber erupted. Trade Minister Gela Soon was on her feet immediately, her 6 limbs splayed in the Dravosi posture of alarm, and she was shouting something about fuel contracts and economic obligations, and 3 other delegates were trying to speak at once, and Speaker Val Kesson was hammering his gavel against the podium so hard that the sound echoed off the crystal walls like gunshots. But Okonkwo did not stop, and he did not turn around, because he knew that the moment he walked through that door the second phase would begin. And it did. Across 12 star systems, every human embassy went dark at the same moment. Lights off, communications severed, doors sealed, and within the hour prepositioned shuttles arrived to evacuate staff who had already packed their belongings and were waiting on landing pads with the calm efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact scenario 40 times. On 9 trade stations, human merchants closed their shops and human doctors locked their clinics, and human engineers shut down the systems they had been maintaining for alien clients, and they left notes on the doors that said simply, "Services terminated. No further inquiries will be accepted." And then the Prometheus Array activated. It began as a whisper in the data streams, a quiet insertion into every conquered communication relay, every news network, every public information channel. And then the whisper became a roar as the array broadcast a single massive data packet to every connected device in the galaxy simultaneously. The packet contained everything. Every exploitative clause hidden in every treaty Earth had signed, every rigged vote in the Conquered's records, every back-channel communication between elder species discussing how to keep humanity contained, every internal memo from the Dravosi Trade Ministry about artificially inflating fuel prices for younger species, every Thanari strategic assessment that described humans as a threat to be managed rather than allies to be respected. 3 centuries of galactic hypocrisy, translated into every major language, indexed and searchable, delivered directly to the citizens of 312 species who had never been told what their governments were doing in their names. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. On 17 worlds that depended on human pharmaceutical exports, hospitals began rationing medication within 48 hours, and the public demanded to know why their governments had allowed a single species to become their sole medical supplier without building any backup. And the answer was that the Conquered had deliberately prevented those species from developing their own pharmaceutical industries, because dependency was easier to control than independence. On 9 colony worlds that used human terraforming technology, environmental systems began degrading because the maintenance contracts had been canceled, and engineers scrambled to understand machines they had never been trained on because the Conquered's technology framework had banned knowledge sharing between lower-tier species. The Conquered convened an emergency session, and the chamber was full for the first time in years, and the mood was panic disguised as outrage. Speaker Valkessen called for calm and received none. Trade Minister Gela soon presented economic projections that showed cascading supply chain failures across 40 systems within 6 months, and the numbers were so alarming that 2 delegates fainted, or at least performed the biological equivalent for their species. And then Dreth Varro, the Korvathi delegate who had called humans prey animals, stood and proposed the thing that everyone had been thinking but no one had wanted to say out loud. "We send a fleet," he said, and his voice was the rumble of rocks falling down a mountainside. "We remind the humans that withdrawal is not an option, that they signed binding agreements, and that the Conquered enforces its treaties with force when necessary." The vote was swift and overwhelming, 268 in favor, 31 against, 13 abstaining, and within 72 hours an expeditionary fleet of 80 warships from 9 species assembled at the edge of human space under the command of Fleet Admiral Corvus Gen, a veteran Korvathi commander who had broken 3 younger species in similar punitive actions, and who expected this one to be no different. The fleet entered Sol space on a bright, clear morning, if morning meant anything in the void between planets, and Admiral Gen stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Edict of Ages, and watched his tactical display, expecting to see the 30 or so human defense ships that Conquered intelligence had catalogued. His sensors found them, a modest line of destroyers and frigates arranged in a defensive formation between Mars and the asteroid belt, and Gen allowed himself a grunt of satisfaction, because this was exactly what he had expected, a token resistance that would fold under pressure. Then the asteroid belt lit up. 214 contacts rising from the dark between the rocks, ships that had not been there a moment ago, ships that Conquered sensors had never detected, ships that were running on power signatures his tactical officer had never seen before, and they were not small. They were a full battle fleet with destroyers and frigates and electronic warfare cruisers, and at the center of it, all a command carrier so large that Gen's flagship looked like a shuttle beside it. Commander Reese Tanaka sat in the command chair of the UN Thermopylae and opened a channel that reached every ship in the conquered fleet simultaneously, and his voice was quiet and precise and carried the weight of 30 years of preparation. "You were not invited," he said. "You have 60 seconds." Fleet Admiral Corvus Gen had broken 3 species in his career, and each time the pattern had been the same. The younger race would bluster, then bargain, then beg, and then the conquered fleet would disable their defenses and install a compliance governor, and the matter would be settled within a week, and the galaxy would move on as if nothing had happened because nothing had, not really, not in any way that mattered to the powers that held the levers. He expected the humans to follow the same script. He was wrong about that. Gen stood on the bridge of the Edict of Ages and stared at his tactical display, where 214 human warships had appeared from nowhere like ghosts rising from a graveyard, and his first officer, a young Corvathi named Seska, was reading sensor data in a voice that was trying very hard to stay professional and failing. "Admiral, the unknown contacts are running on power signatures we cannot identify. Their energy output is approximately 3 times what our own reactors produce, and they are accelerating toward intercept positions at speeds that exceed our maximum by a factor of 2. Gen did not respond immediately because he was doing the math that every military commander does when the situation changes, the math of pride versus survival, and the numbers were not good. But retreat was not an option either, because Fleet Admiral Corvus Gen had been sent here by 268 voting species to enforce the will of the conquered, and if he turned around without firing a single shot, then the conquered's authority would crack like glass dropped on stone, and every young species in the galaxy would learn that the old powers could be defied. So he did what soldiers have done since the first war on the first world, in the first system that ever produced creatures stupid enough to fight. He doubled down. "All ships battle formation Kesari 7, he ordered, and his voice carried the deep calm of someone who had chosen his path and would walk it to the end. "Weapons hot, shields to full. Target the largest human vessel and prepare to engage on my command." 80 conquered warships rearranged themselves into a spearhead formation aimed at the heart of the human fleet, and for a brief moment, the void between Mars and Jupiter was filled with the geometry of war, 2 forces facing each other across a gap that was shrinking by the second. On the Thermopylae, Commander Reese Tanaka watched the conquered fleet form up, and he felt nothing that resembled surprise because he had been running simulations of this exact scenario for 6 years, and the conquered was doing exactly what his models predicted, and he turned to his communications officer and said, "Open channel to all shadow envelope units." The channel opened, and Tanaka spoke to 214 ships simultaneously. "This is Thermopylae Actual. Weapons are authorized, but rules of engagement are absolute. Disable only. I repeat, disable only. No killing shots, no reactor strikes, no life support targeting. We are not here to make corpses. We are here to make a point." Tanaka out. The 60 seconds expired, and Admiral Gen gave the order to fire, and the conquered fleet unleashed its opening volley, a wall of plasma bolts and kinetic rounds and guided torpedoes that lit up the void like a sunrise made of violence. The human fleet did not die. It did not need to. The Prometheus Array had been inside the Conquered's communication infrastructure for over a decade, and in the 3 seconds before the first shot was fired, it reached into every Conquered warship and pulled their encryption keys like a pickpocket lifting wallets in a crowd. And Tanaka's electronic warfare cruisers used those keys to broadcast a cascade of false targeting data directly into the enemy fleet's fire control systems. The Conquered's opening volley missed. Not by a little, not by the kind of margin that could be explained by countermeasures or evasive action, but by a lot, plasma bolts sailing into empty space, torpedoes curving away from their targets and detonating harmlessly against asteroids, kinetic rounds passing through gaps in the human formation that should not have existed. Gen watched his entire opening salvo accomplish nothing, and for the first time in his long career, he felt a cold weight settle in his chest that might have been fear. "Recalibrate targeting systems," he snapped. "Manual override, all ships fire at will." But by then the humans had already moved. The Shadow Envelope fleet hit the Conquered formation like a scalpel cutting through cloth, and they did not attack the way the Conquered expected. They did not aim for hulls or reactors or crew sections. Instead, they targeted the specific systems that made a warship, rather than a very expensive piece of floating metal. Engines first. Human precision missiles, guided by targeting data that was updated in real time by the Prometheus Array, struck the engine housings of Conquered warships with surgical accuracy, and each missile carried a specialized warhead designed not to destroy, but to overload, sending cascading power surges through propulsion systems that shut them down completely and left the ships drifting. Then weapons. A second wave of strikes hit weapons arrays and torpedo launchers and shield generators, not destroying them but fusing their power couplings so thoroughly that repair would take weeks in a shipyard. Then communications. The Prometheus Array jammed every Conquered frequency simultaneously, isolating each ship from the others, and suddenly 80 warships that had been a coordinated fleet became 80 individual vessels floating blind and deaf and helpless in the dark. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, every single Conquered warship was dead in space, intact but powerless, their crews alive and unharmed but their ships reduced to nothing more than very large lifeboats drifting slowly through the asteroid belt. Not one ship had been destroyed. Not one crew member on either side had been killed. On the bridge of the Edict of Ages, Admiral Gen stood in the dim emergency lighting that had replaced the main power, and he stared at a tactical display that was no longer displaying anything because the display had been fried along with everything else. And around him, his bridge crew sat in stunned silence because they had never lost before. None of them had ever lost before, and losing was supposed to happen to other species, younger species, weaker species, not to them. Gen's personal communicator crackled, a direct point-to-point signal that bypassed the jammed fleet communications, and a voice came through that was not Tanaka's. It was Lian Cheng's. "Admiral Gen," the General Secretary said, and her voice was as calm as a lake at midnight. "Your crews will be returned safely. Your ships will be towed beyond our border. You will be provided with enough fuel and supplies for the journey home, and your wounded, of which I am told there are very few, will receive medical attention from our fleet surgeons before departure." Gen said nothing because there was nothing to say. "But understand this," Cheng continued, and now her voice carried an edge that could have cut through the hull of his flagship. "We did not destroy your fleet because we did not need to. We disabled 80 warships in 11 minutes without killing a single being on either side. And we did this not because we lack the capacity for destruction, but because we chose restraint. Do not test whether we are willing to make a different choice." The channel went silent. Over the next 48 hours, human engineering teams boarded each disabled Conquered vessel and provided food and water and medical supplies to crews who expected to be imprisoned or executed, and instead were treated with a courtesy that confused them more than cruelty ever could have. And human tugs towed each ship to the edge of Sol space and released them with enough emergency power to limp home. Admiral Gen was the last to leave, and as his flagship was towed past the Thermopylae, he looked out a viewport and saw Commander Tanaka standing at an observation window looking back at him. And Tanaka raised one hand in what might have been a salute, or might have been a wave, or might have been nothing at all. And Gen did not return the gesture because his pride would not allow it. But somewhere beneath the pride, a small, honest voice told him that he had just been beaten by a species that could have killed him and chose not to. and that this was worse than any defeat he could have imagined. The news reached the Conquered before the fleet did. The Prometheus Array made sure of that. Every detail of the Battle of the Threshold was broadcast across the galaxy in real time, not as propaganda, but as raw, unedited sensor data that any species could analyze and verify. And what they saw was an elder race fleet, humiliated without a single casualty, by a species that the Conquered had classified as too primitive for full membership. The political earthquake was immediate. Speaker Val Kesson called for calm, and for the third time received none. Trade Minister Gela soon quietly began transferring personal assets to systems outside Conquered jurisdiction, which told everyone who was paying attention exactly how much confidence she had in the future of the current order. And in the back channels, in the encrypted communications that ran between embassies and governments and intelligence agencies across 100 worlds, 3 species made quiet contact with Earth. The Velesi, a young avian race who had been under Conquered trade restrictions for 60 years. The Makhori, an amphibious species whose colonial ambitions had been crushed by the same kind of treaties that had been used against humanity. And the Toruan, a silicon-based species that had been providing raw materials to the elder races at a fraction of fair value for over a century. They all sent the same message through different channels at different times, but the meaning was identical. We want to talk. 6 months after the Battle of the Threshold, the galaxy looked like a mirror that had been cracked but not shattered, and the fractured lines ran through every institution and alliance and assumption that had held the old order in place for thousands of years. The Conquered still existed, but it was smaller now, quieter. A body that had once spoken for 312 species and now spoke for barely 200, because the rest had either left or stopped listening, and the ones who remained did so not out of loyalty, but out of fear of what would happen if they stepped into the open without the old structure to protect them. Earth had not asked for the chaos, but Earth had prepared for it. In the rebuilt city of New Geneva, in a hall that human architects had designed to look nothing like the Conquered chamber, with circular seating at a single level so that no species sat above or below any other, the new Geneva Accords were about to begin. Ambassador Idris Okonkwo stood at the entrance and watched the delegations arrive, and each one that walked through the doors added another line to a story that he had not believed possible 6 months ago. The Velesi came first, a delegation of tall, feathered beings who moved with the careful grace of birds walking on unfamiliar ground, and their lead diplomat, a female named Kira Ethan, shook Okonkwo's hand with taloned fingers and said in accented English that she had learned in the last 3 months, "We have waited 60 years for someone to build a door that we could walk through." The Makhori came next, amphibious beings who breathed through gills and spoke through vibrating membranes on their throats, and they brought gifts of bioluminescent coral from their homeworld that glowed in shifting patterns that their ambassador explained represented gratitude in a language older than speech. The Toruan came in environmental suits because they were silicon-based and could not breathe Earth's atmosphere, but they came, and that was what mattered. 14 species attended in person and 30 more sent observers through secure communication links. And as Okonkwo looked around the circular hall, he saw something that the Conquered had never allowed, a room where every seat was the same height and every voice carried the same weight, and no one was placed near the drainage vents. General Secretary Chung opened the session with a speech that lasted exactly 4 minutes because she believed that leaders who talked too long were usually hiding the fact that they had nothing to say. "This is not a replacement for the Conquered," she said. "This is an alternative to it, built on a simple principle that should never have been controversial but somehow was, that every species deserves a voice, and that treaties must serve all signatories equally or they serve no one at all." She outlined the framework that Earth's diplomatic corps had spent 6 months drafting in consultation with every attending species. No provisional memberships. Every species that signed the Accords would have full voting rights from the first day. All treaties must be mutual. No unilateral restrictions on development. No population caps. No technology bans designed to keep younger species dependent on older ones. Shared science rather than hoarded science. Open source databases for terraforming and medical research and agricultural technology. Free to access, free to use, free to improve upon. Military alliances based on collective defense, meaning that an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. But no offensive pacts, no punitive expeditions, no enforcement fleets sent to discipline species that refused to comply with rules they had no voice in creating. The applause when she finished was not thunderous because there were not enough beings in the room for thunder, but it was real, and it came from species that had spent decades being told they were too young or too small or too strange to matter. Okonkwo chaired the first working session, and he did it with the same calm dignity he had shown when the Conquered laughed at him, except now the room was listening instead of laughing, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a cage and an open sky. They worked through the details over 17 days, arguing and compromising and rewriting clauses at 3 in the morning, when the translators were exhausted, and the coffee had run out, and the Makhori ambassador kept accidentally flooding the bathroom because his species was not designed for human plumbing. It was messy and slow and sometimes frustrating, and it was the most honest diplomatic process any of them had ever been part of. On the 9th day, something unexpected happened. A shuttle arrived at New Geneva carrying a single passenger, and when the passenger walked into the hall, the room went silent in a way that was very different from the silences Okonkwo had experienced at the Conquered. Speaker Zoreth Valkesson stood in the doorway, his bioluminescent plates cycling through colors that Okonkwo had never seen before, blues and greens, and a deep amber that might have meant uncertainty, or might have meant something that the Thenari did not have a word for. He had not come as a representative of the Conquered. He had come as an observer, alone, without staff or security or the ceremonial robes of his office, wearing simple clothing that made him look less like the most powerful politician in the galaxy, and more like what he actually was, a very old being who was watching the world he had built begin to change. Jung allowed him to stay, because turning him away would have been the kind of petty cruelty that the old order dealt in, and the new one was trying to leave behind. Valkesson sat in the observer gallery for 3 days without speaking, watching every session, listening to every debate, studying the way these younger species interacted with each other as equals rather than as petitioners and gatekeepers. On the 12th day, he requested a private meeting with Okonkwo. They met in a small room with a window that looked out over Lake Geneva, and the water was silver in the afternoon light, and the mountains beyond it were capped with snow, and Valkesson looked at the view for a long time before he spoke. "Your world is beautiful," he said, and his voice was quieter than Okonkwo had ever heard it, stripped of the resonance and authority that usually filled it. "I have read that your species nearly destroyed it several times before you learned to take care of it." "We did," Okonkwo said. "We are not always wise, but we are usually stubborn enough to fix what we break." Valkesson turned from the window and looked at the human ambassador, and his bioluminescent plates settled into a steady deep blue that Okonkwo recognized as the Thenari expression for something close to honesty. "We feared you," Valkesson said. "From the moment your first ship crossed into conquered space, we feared you, not because you were powerful. You were not powerful then, but because you were adaptable in a way that we had never encountered." He paused and his plates flickered. "Every other species we elevated stayed within the shape we gave them. They accepted the boundaries. They grew at the rate we permitted. They developed along the paths we designed, and they were grateful, or at least they pretended to be. And the system worked because it was stable, and stability was what we valued above all else." But not us, Okonkwo said. Not you, Valkesson agreed. Your species refuses to stay in any shape. You change constantly. You adapt to everything. You take what you are given and you improve it, and then you improve the improvement. And within a single generation, you are somewhere that our projections said you should not reach for centuries. And this terrified us because if you could not be shaped then, you could not be controlled. And if you could not be controlled then, the entire structure we had spent millennia building was at risk. Okonkwo listened, and he did not interrupt because he understood that what was happening in this room was something rare, an admission that cost more than most beings would ever be willing to pay. So we contained you, Valkesson said. We wrapped you in treaties and restrictions, and we put you at the bottom of the chamber, and we told ourselves that this was for the good of the galaxy, and perhaps some of us even believed it. The old Thanari fell silent and looked at his hands, 4 of them, folded together in a gesture that might have been prayer or might have been surrender. You could have simply respected us, Okonkwo said, and his voice was not angry and not bitter and not triumphant. It was just sad. It would have cost you nothing. Valkesson had no answer for that. They stood together in silence for a while, 2 beings from 2 species, separated by millennia of evolution and thousands of light years of space, looking out at a lake on a small, stubborn world that had refused to be contained. The Accords were signed on the 17th day, and 14 species put their marks on a document that was shorter than most conquered treaties, because it did not need to hide anything in subclauses, and it did not need 800 pages to disguise exploitation as partnership. The Conquered did not collapse, not immediately, not dramatically, but it contracted the way a tide pulls back from a shore, slowly and steadily, and with the certainty that what had been revealed by its retreat could never be covered again. Some elder species joined the new Geneva framework within months, quietly, without fanfare, signing the same agreements that younger species had signed and sitting in the same level seats, and voting with the same single vote. Others retreated into isolation, closing their borders and hoarding their knowledge, and pretending that the galaxy had not changed. But the galaxy had changed, and pretending otherwise did not make it less true. The web grew. Not a hierarchy with the powerful at the top and the weak at the bottom, but a web with connections running in every direction, species helping species not because a treaty forced them to, but because the framework made cooperation easier than exploitation, and it was imperfect, and messy, and sometimes the Makhori ambassador still flooded the bathroom. But it was real. 3 years after the Accords were signed, on a colony world called Nova Cascadia at the edge of human space, a park opened in the center of the first city. Human engineers had built the structures and Velisi architects had designed the canopy to filter sunlight through colored glass, and Toruan geologists had shaped the stone paths, and Makhori botanists had planted gardens that combined flora from 4 different worlds into something that should not have worked, but did. Because sometimes beauty is what happens when different kinds of life decide to grow together, instead of apart. Captain Una Vasquez, retired now, with gray in her hair and a calmness in her eyes that had not been there when she sat in the Conquered chamber with her fists clenched and her fury burning, sat on a bench in that park and watched children play. Human children and Velisi chicks and a young Toruan, in a miniature environmental suit, who kept trying to collect rocks, and a pair of Makhori tadpole children who had found a fountain and were refusing to come out of it. A Velisi child, small and bright-feathered, wandered over to her bench and looked up at her with golden eyes and asked the question that children always ask strangers. "What was it like where you come from?" Vasquez looked at the child and then at the park, and then at the sky where 2 suns were setting in colors that Earth had never seen, and she smiled. "Small," she said, "stubborn and very, very patient." The child considered this and then ran off to join the others, and Vasquez sat on her bench in the fading light and listened to the sound of 5 species laughing together. And it sounded like the future, messy and loud and alive. and she thought that maybe this was what victory actually sounded like. Not the silence of a disabled fleet or the scratch of a pen on a treaty, but the noise of children who had never known a galaxy where they were not equal. Playing in a park that should not have existed on a world that should not have been possible, built by a species that the universe had underestimated for the very last time.